Alright, so what's going on, guys? So in today's video, I'm finally going to start the transmission swap. Finally going to get rid of the old 4-speed automatic transmission that's in this thing and put in the 5-speed transmission I pulled out of the Eclipse. Now this is pretty much going to be a direct swap. There's only a little bit of wiring to do and a little bit of cutting. Now you do have to cut the hole for the master cylinder, but the outline is already there in the metal. You just have to follow it. And it's already a place to bolt in the clutch pedal. Like I said, the Eclipse is actually based off the Galant, so this will be pretty straightforward. Now I'm going to give myself a couple days to get this knocked out in case I run into any issues. 2 days should be more than enough time to get this done because it can be done in 1 day. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get this thing up in the air. Trey's on his way. He's going to give me a hand. So let's get started. Alright guys, so these are pretty much all the tools you're going to need. I have a 1/2-inch drive ratchet and an extension. Probably need a couple extensions. A 3/8 drive ratchet and again several extensions. A 32mm socket for your axle nut. In this case I have a 15/16 socket because I didn't have a 24mm, but either one will work. A 17mm socket, a 14, a 12, and a 10. Now here I have a ratcheting wrench. This one's a flex head. I use this to get the shifter cables where they bolt through the firewall. Having the flex head allows you to get to those bolts more easily without having to take off a bunch of the HVAC. A Dremel. We're going to use this to cut the hole for the master cylinder. A Phillips head screwdriver. This is mainly for the interior. A pry bar. And you may need a breaker bar just to help get leverage depending on how rusty your bolts are. And of course, the one tool that you cannot do without to get the pilot bearing out, slice of bread. Now we finally got a use for those end slices that everybody always throws away. So that's it, let's get to it. Alright guys, so first step, of course, got the car jacked up, taking the wheels off. And it's going to be a similar process to what you guys saw in my Eclipse video. So we're going to remove these two bolts. Already got one out. And you're going to remove the bolt where your tie rod is. Your tie rod in, take that off. And again, that's going to let this brake assembly kind of fall out in the way. So we'll be able to take the axles out of the transmission.
Alright, so since I've never done this before, looking at it, it looks like I gotta take off, well, the air box, possibly the battery box. Alright y'all, so if you look right here, we got the battery tray removed and the air box removed. And what that allows us to do is actually now see where our bolts are.
Like I said, you see what we got? Engine mount needs to come out, and a couple bolts on top of the transmission need to come out. What's that? I got the axle out. Now I just need to go into the car and pop the axle from the transmission. Make sure that you have your transmission fluid drained when you're doing this, or else you're gonna make a whole lot of mess. And that's what that paint is under there. I've already got the other side done. Alright, so I couldn't figure out a good way to film this, but when you're under the car, this is what you'll be looking at. This is the orientation of it. I've got it upside down right now. But the two bolts in the front are 17s. These big bolts are 17mm. And when you go back, these bolts here, they're actually gonna be 4 bolts. These are all 14mm. And then of course, attached to the transmission on the top is going to be your engine mount. And then this was a 14.
You can show that.
Yeah, and this is a 14. And you're going to take all these bolts off in order to get this cross member off. But once you have that, you're then clear and you have the space to drop your transmission.
Didn't see that coming. Didn't see that coming. You think it's going to take the other one out?
About to go down.
Literally.
Also, that's why the jack is on there, so it doesn't break anything. So what we're doing is right now the transmission is sitting on the floor jack, and he's going to use the pry bar to push the transmission away from that rear motor mount while we lower it. Alright guys, so after a lot of persuasion, a lot of wiggling, we finally got the transmission out. So once you get it out, this is what you're looking at. You have the big silver thing is your torque converter. It's basically a fluid-filled drum that spins. It also kind of leads to some of your sluggishness on these older transmissions. And then behind it, you have a flex plate, the thing with the teeth on it. So it's not a flywheel. You have a flex plate and a torque converter on automatic. Now the bolts for the flex plate, hard to get to, they're on the back side. I'm gonna take this off and then show you guys once I get it out of the car. And right now the engine is just being supported by the one engine mount and the floor jack. When you pull the axles out, there's gonna be some transmission fluid in those holes. When you're looking at the transmission, this is the bottom of it. This is on the driver's side. You have a drain plug here. It's like a 22mm socket. It actually has very little torque on it. It actually came off pretty easily. So I undid that. Then I also took off these 3 bolts here. Now these bolts have O-rings on the back of them, and there is a bit of fluid behind them. And then of course when you take the axles out, as I said, there'll be some fluid that's gonna come here. So basically there's a lot of transmission fluid in there. Try to do your best to prevent leaks. All right, but from there, most of this hard stuff is already done. The manual transmission is lighter and less cumbersome than the automatic. You got putting it back in as it was to get out. But for now, I'm gonna get the flex plate and the torque converter off. All right, guys, so we're gonna have to use a bit of imagination here. But I feel like this is gonna be the best way to really show you what's going on. So when you're under the car, this is what you're gonna be looking at. There are 4 bolts that hold the torque converter on. And they're actually on the back side of this flex plate here. In order to access them, you have to turn the engine over. On the opposite side of the engine, there's a place where you can put a 1/2-inch drive ratchet or breaker bar, and that can help you to manually turn the engine over. And what I mean by that, you just turn the crank, which will spin this. So what I have here, and I'm on the passenger side of the vehicle, is there's a little access port where again you can fit a 1/2-inch ratchet, and I've got some extensions on it, and manually turn the engine over. Now what this will also do is that while you're trying to take off those bolts for the torque converter, as this will bind up against this plastic and stop it from spinning. So like I said, these bolts are gonna be on the back side of here. Now, when you go to take these off, you'll probably run into a situation where your wrench will want to slip off of this bolt, but again, because it is so thin, so instead of using like a constant pulling motion, what worked best for me is to use the palm of my hand and hit it. And what you can also do is hit it with some WD-40, some PB Blaster or something to help ease that process, but there's not a lot of torque on it. It's just hard. They're just hard to get off because again, they're so thin. So you take all 4 of those off and be careful, because at that point your torque converter will be free. And this is kind of heavy. As you can see where your 4 bolts are, next you'll have access to the flex plate. Here you have 7 bolts, and these again are 17mm just like the ones for the torque converter. You take all these off, and for those I was able to use my impact, and then the flex plate comes off. Now your starter plate, there are a few, there's just 2 10mm bolts, one there and one here. You take those off, and then you're pretty much looking at the block of the engine. I hope that made sense, guys. So that's actually what I'm looking at, is this bearing, this little pilot bearing bushing. This needs to come out. Now I've heard of people using like bearing pullers that you can rent from the AutoZone, using like welding a bolt onto it and using that to get it out. So guys, this is where you want to get your bread out. Now I was a bit skeptical because I've never done it this way, but it's working. So what you do is pack this hole with bread. So you're gonna pack this in that hole, get it in there as best you can. And I'm gonna use just a bolt that I found, that pretty big bolt. And I'm just gonna hammer it in there. And what you'll hear is that eventually it'll bottom out. Once you hear the bolt hitting metal, we'll try to repack it. And I don't know if you saw that, but the pilot bearing actually moved a little bit. And you can see at this point, it's actually loose. So I'm just gonna repeat the steps. Kind of ball the bread up a little bit to help get it in there. And you guys see that? Up, and there it goes. It's actually all the way out. And that was extremely easy. It only took half of the top bun to get that out. But what happens is, as you kind of pack the bread in there, it gets behind it and kind of gets in the hole and starts pushing it out as it builds up. And as you kind of hammer it in. So now I've got a relatively clean surface here. So who would have thought bread would be the answer to those problems? Now, the first time I did that, I hadn't heard about the bread method. I know it's a similar method you can do with grease. That's extremely messy. Here going forward, bread is going to be my preferred tool when it comes to pilot bearing removal. Actually, guys, when I went to look at it, I think the automatic and the manual starter plates are the same on these cars. So you actually didn't need to take this off in the first place. All right, guys, so unfortunately, I've hit a stopping point. So the one thing I forgot to order was a clutch alignment tool. So with that said, I'm pretty much done under here as far as what I can do. I got that part ordered already.